The Blitzkrieg of 1940, a series of stunning victories for Hitler, revealed to the world the terrifying effectiveness of the Wehrmacht's new war machine. This was not merely the success of individual branches of the military, tanks, air force, infantry, but a symphony of destruction, a striking coordination of all elements of a complex military mechanism. The impeccable work of intelligence, sabotage groups sowing panic and destruction in the enemy's rear, devastating air raids and surgically precise strikes on strategic targets, lightning-fast breakthroughs by armored wedges sweeping away everything in their path, and unconventional, sometimes incredibly bold, strategic decisions by the German command. All this together created an effect of self-sustaining enemy defeat, triggering a chain reaction of chaos and demoralization in the ranks of the Allied armies. Panic spread with incredible, truly viral speed, transforming the population of occupied countries into a mob crazed with fear, deprived not only of any will to resist, but also of elementary self-control, and regular armies into disorganized, scattered masses of demoralized soldiers who had completely lost faith in the possibility of victory. It was this nightmarish scenario, this military avalanche, that Poland, France, and then other victims of Hitler's aggression faced. They were fatally unprepared for such a swift and crushing onslaught, for such high intensity and dynamism of combat operations. Soviet historians, wishing to emphasize the uniqueness and grand scale of the Great Patriotic War, often resorted to a peculiar method of comparison, counting the number of days it took European countries to cease organized resistance to the Wehrmacht. They tended to see the swift defeats of France, Poland, and other countries as merely confirmation of the established ideological thesis of a prior collusion of capitalist governments, thanks to which, allegedly, the German army made its triumphal march from one European capital to another, encountering no serious resistance. A real world war, a war of extermination, a total war, it only became from June 22, 1941. Before that, it was nothing more than a triumphal march of Hitler's divisions across Europe, was the dominant view of Soviet researchers. Moreover, in Soviet historiography, it was considered practically obligatory to present the Allies, particularly France and Great Britain, as an example of military helplessness, inefficiency, and even cowardice. For example, in Gorbatenko's book, The Shadow of the Luftwaffe over Europe, it is asserted that German losses in air battles in France in 1940 amounted to 1239 aircraft, which, according to the author, did not seriously affect the combat effectiveness of the Luftwaffe. However, what seems rather strange, in the same book he states that 1,284 German aircraft destroyed in the first month of the war with the USSR were unprecedented losses for the German Air Force since the beginning of World War II. The impression is created of a clear double standard, a desire to downplay the successes of the Allies and simultaneously exaggerate the losses of the Germans on the Eastern Front. How objective is this picture? Did the complete and disorderly flight of Polish and French troops and the unconditional, triumphal march of the Germans across Europe really take place? First, let us turn to irrefutable facts, to dry figures, and compare the losses of the first weeks of the Soviet-German War with the corresponding figures of the Wehrmacht in Poland, September 1939, and France, May-June 1940. Polish campaign: 14,000 killed and missing, 30,000 wounded, total losses: 44,000 men. French campaign: 45,000 killed and missing, 111,000 wounded, total losses: 156,000 men. This data is taken from a classic work of military history, the book by Kurt von Tippelskirch, History of the Second World War. More precise, refined data presented in the equally authoritative work by Burkhard Müller-Hillebrand, The German Army 1933-1945, show irrefutable Wehrmacht, irreplaceable losses of 17,000 men in Poland and 49,000 men in France. This irrefutably proves that France offered fierce resistance and did not capitulate immediately. Praised France, contrary to the widespread myth, fought for 44 days. Irreplaceable German losses in the first month of the war with the USSR from June 22 to July 31, 1941, approximately 40 days, amounted to 44,027 non-commissioned officers and men and 2,443 officers, a total of 46,500 men. These figures are practically identical to the Wehrmacht's losses in France, although Soviet historiography traditionally depicted the French army as retreating in disarray, while the Red Army, according to the same historiography, waged a heroic, self-sacrificing defensive war. It should not be forgotten that during this period a colossal territory of 700,000 sq.m. was lost, which is approximately 3 times the area of Poland, which resisted the Wehrmacht for exactly 1 month. Now let's compare the pace of the Wehrmacht's advance in France and the USSR during the first 3 weeks of hostilities. Why exactly 3 weeks? Because after 3 weeks the Germans halted their rapid advance in France to regroup their forces, or, as some historians believe, to allow the British troops to evacuate the Expeditionary Corps from Dunkirk. It was this halt that German generals later considered Hitler's strategic mistake, which allowed the Allies to preserve a significant part of their army. A similar operational pause, a period of relative lull in hostilities, also occurred in 1941, when German troops reached the Pskov-Smolensk-Zhytomyr line. The offensive on France began on May 10, 1940. By May 31st, German troops reached Dunkirk. The distance by road between Duisburg and Dunkirk is 340 kilometers. Dividing 340 by 21 days, we get an average daily rate of advance of 16 kilometers. In 1941, the distance on the route of Army Group North Klaipeda-Pskov by road is 585 kilometers. Dividing 585 by 21, we get 27.8 kilometers per day. Army Group Center covered the distance by road from Brest to Smolensk, 627 kilometers, in 21 days. Dividing 627 by 21, we get 29.8 kilometers per day. In Ukraine, during the same period, the Germans advanced from Rava-Ruskaya to Zhytomyr, 445 kilometers. Dividing 445 by 21, we get 21.2 kilometers per day. These figures clearly demonstrate that in the first 3 weeks of the war in the USSR, the Germans advanced significantly, sometimes twice as fast than in Western Europe. Thus, the assertion that the war in the West was a leisurely stroll, a triumphal march for the Wehrmacht, is a clear exaggeration. The Allied armies, despite all their problems and mistakes, put up stubborn resistance, suffered heavy losses, and tied up significant enemy forces. However, the political and military leadership of Poland, and especially France, proved unable to effectively mobilize all the resources of their countries, prepare them for total war, and organize a long-term, deeply echeloned defense. The Red Army, although forced to retreat with fighting, heroically resisting the onslaught of a vastly superior enemy, systematically traded territory and manpower for the most valuable resource, time necessary for conducting general mobilization, evacuating industry, and restructuring the entire economy onto military rails. Neither France nor Poland had such strategic space for retreat, such a reserve of territory and population. They did not have their own Volga to retreat behind in order to regroup and launch a counteroffensive.